It's a delight to be with you here. I really enjoyed the story. I am the founding CEO of Headwaters that's located in Missoula, but our foundation serves the 15 county region that used to be the footprint of Community Hospital. I am originally from Guatemala, actually, so I'm very interested, Sandy, in what the connection is to Guatemala. My parents moved to San Francisco when I was a baby, so I didn't really get to grow up in Guatemala. Grew up in the Bay Area and lived most of my life in California before coming to Montana. I'd never been to Montana before I got recruited for this job. I had no idea that it was so wonderful to live here. So feel pretty lucky that I found my way to Montana. And just from a professional background, I'm originally trained as an attorney. I hated being an attorney. Then I went into policy work, and from policy work got recruited into philanthropy. And I've been in the field of philanthropy for about 20 years. And Headwaters, I think, is like my sixth foundation. And all of them have been health conversion foundations, which I'm going to talk about a little bit here. And can I share my screen so we can look at the PowerPoint?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Great.
You can see
so
that.
I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about health conversion foundations. Health conversions foundations are something that have been growing across the United States, probably starting in the late 80s. And the idea behind health conversion foundations came from this movement that started to happen in the health industry, where traditionally in America, there were a lot of health entities, health plans, hospitals, clinics, medical groups that were started as not-for-profits. And over the course of the 80s and 90s, a lot of these entities were sold and went from being nonprofits to becoming for-profits. And when a nonprofit is in existence, it doesn't have to pay taxes. And as a result, there is an accumulation of wealth that gets put into that organization over a period of time. And when these health entities that were not-for-profits are being sold, the question became who is the beneficiary of those dollars if it's a not-for-profit historically. And that led to the creation of health conversion foundations. And the idea being that in every state, there are laws and regulations that govern this, that when a health entity is converted from a nonprofit to a for-profit, those resources then have to be given back to community. And in many places, that means the creation of a health conversion foundation. So here in Missoula, you had Community Hospital that was a not-for-profit hospital that was supported by many folks in the region to build it and run it and operate it. And eventually they got to a point where they felt like it would make more sense to sell it. And I wasn't here, so I can't explain all the reasons behind it, but that decision was made. And when that hospital sold, it generated a significant amount of resources. Actually, it ended up being about $100 million. And that became the basis upon which Headwaters was built. And I think if many of you followed the story of what was happening when the hospital sold, you know that there was a lot of discussion about where this money should live. Should it go to existing entities? Should it go to the university? Should it go to create a new foundation? And ultimately, the Attorney General and the people that were affiliated with the sale decided to create this new health conversion foundation. Now, the way health conversion foundations operate, and I'm just going to give this little brief background to you, is that you have an endowment, which for us is $100 million, and you take that endowment and you invest it. And we have a pretty complex investment portfolio that is a little bit beyond what your and my 401k probably looks like. And the idea behind the investment is that you want to invest it so that you hopefully get somewhere between 8 and 10%. And the reason that you aim for that percentage is that health conversion foundations under the IRS tax law are required to give away 5% of their assets every year. So for Headwaters, that would mean that we would be giving out about $5 million in grants every year. Now, in order to allow the foundation to exist in perpetuity, we have to generate income in order to be able to maintain our corpus at the same time of meeting the 5% distribution requirement and also having the resources that we need to operate the foundation. So that's sort of the business model behind how foundations work. And the IRS set the 5% distribution based on historically what investment portfolios in the market have done in order to both allow the foundation to exist and also meet its 5% payout obligation. And then that leads to the creation of these foundations whose job it is to really serve the needs of community. And one of the things that I often say at Headwaters is that when this foundation was created, the resources of the foundation don't actually belong to me and the staff. They don't belong to the board either. They really belong to the people of Western Montana. And it's our job at Headwaters to figure out how we best deploy those resources out via a philanthropic model. So here's a little bit of timeline. We talked about, the hospital being sold in 2015. 2016 was a year of formation where there was a lot of behind the scenes that was being done by the folks that were involved in the sale of the hospital and the decision to create a new foundation. 2017, I kind of labeled the startup phase. I actually came to Headwaters in 2017, right about the middle of the year. And when I got here, because I have this fundamental belief that we need to be accountable to the community, we started by me going out and having roughly about 600, 700 cups of coffee across Western Montana. And as you know, that's a lot of people in Montana. And it ranged from high school students to hospital CEOs, nonprofit leaders in every community that we serve. We also had a series of community meetings in every county where we invited folks to participate in a conversation around, if you were running this foundation, what are the issues and populations that you would like to serve? And all the information that was collected from those one-on-one coffee conversations and those community meetings became the process by which the board adopted a strategic plan in 2018. And also determined the approach that we're taking, which is really a different and innovative approach in terms of how philanthropy works. And then 2019 and 20 years have really been, the expansion of our grant making and the development of our theory of change and understanding what's happening as a result of Headwaters being around. So who is Headwaters Foundation at this particular moment? I think it's important to start with both the mission and some commitments that we have made. So from a mission perspective, we have this idea at Headwaters that we need to work side by side with Western Montanans to improve the health of our communities. And I think the two sections that are bolded on this slide are really important to call out. Side by side is really important because unlike many foundations, we don't believe that we have the answers. The board doesn't have the answers. The staff doesn't have the answers. It's really the people that are on the ground living the experience of what it's like to be in Western Montana, and the nonprofits that support those communities to improve the health of the families and children that live in those communities. And from a commitment perspective, the foundation has really adopted, and I think the board has really been on board with this notion that we have to be community driven. And there are a lot of foundations in this country that say that they are, but I feel like being at Headwaters, we've had an opportunity to really make that come life in ways that really shifts the power dynamic so that the board isn't the one that's sitting and reviewing grant proposals. It really is the community coming and having conversations with the staff about what's going on, what they need, and then us releasing the resources that we have the honor and privilege of stewarding. So there's this notion of power sharing, right? That we don't have all the answers. The other thing that I think is important to share is this notion of simplifying philanthropy. I don't know how many of you have either run nonprofits or sat on nonprofit boards, but one of the things that nonprofits face is sort of the challenges of navigating philanthropy, of having to compete in RFPs and LOIs. RFPs are requests for proposals, LOIs are letter of interest, submitting lots of documentation, putting in hours and hours to put together applications to try to get resources from foundations, and then sitting and waiting for months before you find out if you're even going to get the money. So my question when I came to Headwaters is, I'm not sure what the value add is of all that bureaucracy that we have in philanthropy. And so we've tried to really simplify it where no one actually applies to us. We do all of the behind the scene works after we've had conversations with organizations in the communities about what they need. We've also got a couple of real interesting grant programs that have simplified the process to a way that kind of is a little bit really innovative, cutting edge in the field of philanthropy. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we also, really think about this notion of being relational, taking an approach of trying to be humble and listen and be transparent. Again, because historically the dynamic between foundations and nonprofits is that the foundation is the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-directing, and really have a philosophical different approach at Headwaters. So the strategic focus, as I said, came directly from those coffee conversations and those community meetings that we had. And in those conversations, there were themes that kept coming up that became the basis of this strategic focus. What we heard from Western Montanans is that they wanted Headwaters to not really look at just putting Band-Aids on the significant health problems that exist in our state, but rather focus upstream on those factors that are keeping Montanans from being healthy. We also heard very clearly that the way to do this is to not just focus on health care, but to really look at the social, economic, and physical environmental factors in the communities that we serve, because those are the drivers of what is creating the health problems in Montana. And then they also said to us that if we work upstream at these problems, this might be the way for the next generation of Montanans to become healthier. And that was really important because folks were saying to us, don't just think about the immediate needs right now, but really take the long-term approach. Everybody was feeling pretty lucky to be able to have a resource like Headwaters and the opportunity for us to be here for a long time, since we're supposed to exist in perpetuity. And that if we had that ability and the resources that we had, then looking at a generational long-term approach is what folks said to us we needed to do. So how do we do our work at Headwaters? First of all, we do grant making. That's what foundations tend to do. But at Headwaters, we believe that we have the ability to not only deploy the resources via grant making that we steward, we also have to think about how else we can be partners to nonprofits and the work that they're doing to address the social determinants of health. One of the things we heard in those conversations, again with community, was that a lot of nonprofits that are already existing and doing many of the things that need to be supported lack from an opportunity to build their capacity across a number of fronts, and that it is important for us to think about how we can deploy our resources around capacity building. We also think that we have the ability to elevate the voice of everyday Montanans in conversations that are around social determinants of health, both at the local and at the state level. And that we can set tables where people can come together to have those conversations, to identify the challenges that exist in communities and also solutions that might be possible here in Montana. And then the last thing that we think about in terms of our work is how we can inform policy, realizing that long-term systems change that will really get upstream and address those social determinants of health is going to be informed and driven by whatever policy decisions are taken in Montana. And so we believe that Headwaters can play a role in bringing information and data and other resources to inform good policy making in our state. So this is a model that I like to show because it sort of talks, it has a big picture of what we're all about. So we obviously are grant makers. And so the big buckets of grant making that we have are these 4 different bubbles on the left-hand side of the slide. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you have the toolkit that we have, which aligns with sort of the other things that we think we can do around the role that we can play beyond grant making. So you see there again, the capacity building, the convening, the connecting. And then the last one is this notion of funder engagement. One of the things that I have found interesting coming to Montana is that there are a number of foundations and philanthropic leaders in this state but there has historically been very little collaboration and coordination of these efforts. And so what role can we play in really trying to leverage all the resources that exist in the philanthropic sector in Montana to try to advance goals especially in those areas where there is shared interest. And then the fundamental concept of trust-based change-making philanthropy sits at the bottom as bedrock to our work. And this trust-based notion is that notion of really ceding power and letting community drive. And change-making philanthropy is that notion, again, that we're taking a long-term systems change approach. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to share with you a little bit about the different grant-making programs that we have. And the first one that I want to talk about is these Go Grant programs. That we deployed from the very beginning when we started. And the idea behind the Go Grant program came from me exploring where in our society are there institutions that provide money to other individuals in the simplest, seamless way possible. And the model that we use to build the Go Grant program is how you and I apply for a credit card. So if we're at a department store and someone asks us if we want to apply for a credit card, they have a little contraption on the desk that asks you to enter usually 3 or 4 different basic pieces of information: your name, your social security number, your income level, and whether you rent or own a house. And then that little machine, spins around, does some magic, and voila, lets you know whether or not they're going to allow you to have $1,000 to buy all the jeans that you want from their store. And it happens instantaneously, and it's rooted on the notion of previous behavior based on your credit and the information that they have. So if banks are willing to do that, why can't philanthropy do that? Was the idea that I had behind the creating of the Go Grant program. So we used that model and worked with some tech companies and developed a real easy to apply program. On average, it takes people about, the first time that requires a little bit more time because they have to create their organizational profile in the system. But after that is done, it takes about 5 minutes to apply. We can approve grants in 24 hours and get a check out in 2 weeks, all paperless. And the way it works is that the system is set up, just like the credit card system is set up, to look at existing sources of information about the organization that is seeking grants from Headwaters. So it's looking to see, first of all, whether or not it's an eligible nonprofit. And we can determine that by looking at the IRS tax base that is available online. It's also looking to see if it's mission aligned with the work of Headwaters. And we can determine that with the word algorithm. The third thing it's looking at is whether or not this organization has been in existence for at least 2 years. And the notion behind that is that we want to make sure that there's a track record of this organization providing the services that they say. And the last piece is determining their location to make sure that they are meeting the needs of the more rural communities in Western Montana. And those last 2 items we can actually check by looking at both their tax information online as well as nonprofit. There's a number of nonprofit databases that we can tap. And that's what allows us to expedite the process. And the notion is, if you're an organization that has been working on social determinants of health for at least 2 years, serving these communities, these resources that we have at Headwaters should be available to you. And they're actually general operating support grants, which is why we call them Go Grants. Over the last 2 years, we've awarded over 200 of these grants in Western Montana. And I want to share a couple of examples, because one of the things that philanthropy often does is they think that we often think we have the answers and we know what we want nonprofits to do, and we have all of these complicated ways to determine that. With Go Grants, we just say, here is the $5,000. It's general operating. You know best what you could do to best support your work. And there are 3 stories that I'll share. One is there was a community that had a school that provided lunches for kids. And at this particular community, over 80% of the students are on free or reduced lunch programs. And in many cases, the children that go to that school the school lunch is really the only place where they get a warm meal. And at that school, at the time that we launched the Go Grants program, the oven that they used had been broken, and they had no resources in the school budget to be able to fix that. So the school said, well, can we apply for this and fix our school oven? Which they did. And they actually didn't even apply for the full $5,000 because they only needed $2,500 to fix the oven. And that meant that those kids who had not been able to have a warm lunch for a period of time were able to get warm meals once the oven was fixed. Another story is just over in Frenchtown, where there is a teacher he's a science teacher that had been interested in doing aquaponic gardening, which is this notion of you have these big tanks with fish, and the fish byproduct is what feeds the plants that are living in the water as opposed to soil. And he had a personal interest in this and was thinking about building this aquaponic garden and bringing it into the school, both as a way to teach kids about this science, but also a way to generate food product that could be used by the school. They didn't have enough resources to be able to buy the size tanks that they needed in order to generate enough fish byproduct. And so the grant that they got from us allowed them to do that and expand their program. And the interesting thing is, like, why would a health foundation fund an aquaponic garden? Well, we did because, one, it generated an opportunity to engage students, and engaged students are going to be healthier from a mental behavioral health perspective. It created food product that was actually being deployed in the school kitchen for healthier lunch options. And they also brought parents in to teach the parents about how to utilize the food product, because it's not generally things that parents might know how to use and incorporate into their cooking. And so it created community at the school. And then the last story I share around Go Grants is there is a lady on the Flathead Reservation that has been building these baby boxes for mothers that don't have a whole lot of resources. And the baby boxes not only include clothing and food and diapers for the babies, but they also serve as sleeping boxes, because many of these families do not have cribs, cannot afford to buy cribs when the babies are little. And these baby boxes are set up so that the babies can sleep safely and not be just put on a bed and be at risk for suffocation when sleeping with parents. So those are a few of the examples of how we have seen these Go Grants really be deployed in communities across Western Montana in ways that I think are making a difference to children and families. The next set of grants that I'll talk about are what we described as strategic initiatives. And the one in particular that I think is worth spending a little bit of time on is the 0 to 5 initiative that we helped seed. Montana is one of the few states that did not have a coordinated early childhood effort in the state across the country. And so the idea here is, could we create an ability for Montana to really have a more intentional approach to addressing 0 to 5 needs, both at the state level, but also locally. So we have a statewide office that does this work at the state level. And then we selected a number of communities that indicated an interest in working on this, Missoula being one of them. And so we have been providing funding over the last 2 years to 0 to 5 Missoula County, which is housed at the United Way. And there are 2 different programs that are underway at that local initiative. And the components of the local initiatives are that they have to be multi-sector, so they can't just be early childhood people talking to each other, but include the school district, the health department, the housing people, all of the different players that touch families around early childhood. And then the other notion is that they had to have a project that was looking at really making a significant systems change in the community. So the 2 projects that 0 to 5 Missoula County have recently launched. One is the Lowell, being part of the Lowell School Community Center. And the Lowell School, as many of you may know, is located in a lower income community neighborhood here in Missoula. And they have partnered together to create a community center that is housed within the school, that provides after school care for the kids that go to school there, have developed a food pantry in partnership with the Missoula Food Bank, have developed an IT program that has allowed parents and children at that school to access laptops that have been really important during this time of COVID, and have also begun to develop a parent education curriculum that will be offered there. The other project, the 0 to 5 Missoula has identified as something that they've been working on, is this kindergarten entry assessment pilot project. And the idea behind this pilot project is how can we in Missoula get a better handle on whether or not children that haven't yet entered kindergarten are doing in terms of their kindergarten readiness, and begin to identify those children that might need some earlier intervention, and work with the teachers in those schools once those children are identified to do some pre-work before or once the kid gets to kindergarten, work with that child and with the parent in order to bring them up to speed and be able to have them more readily able to engage in the kindergarten classroom. And the idea behind this is that this work will be important because a child that starts to fall behind, even at the kindergarten level, becomes that child that is behind all the way through the educational lifespan of that child. So those are two examples of what Missoula County has chosen to do. And again, we provided the funding. They identified these programs. They identified the need, the intervention, these programs, and are running them. And I think they're doing a fabulous job here in Missoula.